When my wife passed away, her wealthy boss called me and said, "I found something. Come to my office right now." Then he added, "And do not tell your son or your daughter-in-law, you could be in danger." When I got there and saw who was standing at the door, I froze. My name is Douglas Pierce. I am 69 years old, and I am still healing from the wounds my own family inflicted upon me. As a retired logistics manager, I thought my life was meant for quiet evenings, but my reality shattered into a million jagged pieces. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who severely underestimated your worth. The rhythmic thud of damp earth striking the polished wood of my wife's casket was the only sound I wanted to hear. It was a hollow, final sound, marking the end of 42 years of shared life. Sylvia was gone. The woman who had packed my lunches for 4 decades, the woman who had rubbed ointment into my aching shoulders after endless shifts on the loading docks, was being lowered into the cold, unforgiving ground. I stood at the edge of the grave, the bitter wind slicing through my thin wool coat, staring down into the dark abyss. My hands, calloused and permanently scarred from moving thousands of tons of freight, trembled slightly. I had broken my back, compromised my knees, and traded the best years of my physical youth to ensure our son Cameron never had to lift a finger in manual labor. I paid every cent of his expensive business school tuition with the sweat from my brow, believing I was building a legacy of respect and love. I was a fool. I shifted my gaze away from the descending casket and looked across the manicured green lawn of the cemetery. Standing a few feet away were Cameron and his wife Vanessa. They were not weeping. They were not holding each other in shared grief. They were staring down at the glowing screens of their smartphones, their thumbs moving rapidly, completely detached from the profound tragedy unfolding before them. Vanessa, dressed in a black designer outfit that looked more suited for a high-end cocktail party than a funeral, sighed loudly, as if the burial was merely a tedious inconvenience interrupting her busy schedule. Cameron did not even bother to wear the tie I had bought him for his graduation. He wore a sharp, custom-fitted suit, radiating the arrogant aura of a man who believed he had outgrown his roots. The minister was still offering the final prayer, his voice a low drone against the wind, when Cameron abruptly pocketed his phone and stepped toward me. He did not offer a hand on my shoulder. He did not ask how I was holding up in the wake of losing my soulmate. Instead, he leaned in close, bringing with him the scent of expensive cologne, and spoke in a tone dripping with calculated condescension. "Dad, we need to handle the practical matters immediately," he whispered sharply, ensuring the remaining few guests could not hear. "You need to sign the house deed over to me by tomorrow morning." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the sheer audacity of his timing. My wife, his mother, had not even been covered in dirt yet, and he was demanding the keys to the kingdom. I remained perfectly silent, letting the cold air wrap around us. "Look, Dad," Cameron continued, his voice taking on that falsely patient tone one might use with a stubborn toddler. "We all know your memory is failing. You left the porch light on twice last week. You are becoming a liability to yourself. Vanessa and I have talked about it, and we agree that it is simply not safe for you to manage the property or your finances anymore. We are doing this for your own good." My memory was not failing. The porch light had been left on because Sylvia always liked it on when she worked late at the corporate office, and I could not bring myself to turn it off after she died. But I did not argue. Arguing was what he wanted. Arguing would give him the ammunition to claim I was volatile. Instead, I embraced the silence. I reached into my coat pocket, my scarred fingers wrapping around my spare set of house keys. I pulled them out and placed them directly into his open waiting palm. I did not utter a single syllable. I simply turned my back on my only child and walked away from the grave, leaving him standing there with a victorious smirk on his face. The gravel path of the cemetery crunched beneath my heavy boots as I made my way to my aging sedan. My chest felt tight, constricted by a suffocating mixture of grief and a newly ignited, simmering rage. I unlocked the car door and slid into the driver's seat, the worn fabric offering no comfort. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white, as I stared out at the gray horizon. Sylvia had supposedly died of a natural aneurysm. That is what the medical examiner had confidently told me. It was swift, he had said. Painless. But as I sat there, the pieces of the puzzle began to violently reject the picture they had formed. Suddenly, the silence of the car was shattered by the harsh, vibrating buzz of my cell phone. I pulled it from my pocket and stared at the caller identification. It was a name I recognized instantly, but had never expected to see on my personal device. Lawrence Croft. He was the billionaire chief executive officer of the global logistics firm where Sylvia had spent the last decade working as an executive auditor. Croft was a man who operated in the stratosphere of wealth and power, a man who communicated through layers of assistants and legal teams. He did not make direct calls to retired freight managers. I pressed the button to answer and raised the phone to my ear. "Mr. Croft," I said, my voice hoarse from the cold and the silence. Douglas Croft said. His voice was not the measured, commanding baritone I had heard at corporate holiday parties. It was sharp-clipped and laced with an unmistakable undercurrent of raw fear. Billionaires do not feel fear unless the foundation of their empire is cracking. Douglas listened to me very carefully. I found something in Sylvia's private vault here at the office. I sat up straight, the exhaustion suddenly vanishing from my bones. "What do you mean, sir? What did you find?" "I cannot discuss this over an unsecured line," Croft replied, his breath hitching slightly. "You need to come to my office right now. Use the private underground parking entrance. I will have security clear you directly to my private elevator." I hesitated for a fraction of a second. "The burial is barely over, Mr. Croft. Cameron and Vanessa are expecting me back at the house to sort through the paperwork." The line went dead quiet for a terrifying moment before Croft's voice returned, dropping to a harsh, desperate whisper. "Do not tell Cameron. Do not tell Vanessa where you are going. Douglas, you must understand me. You could be in immediate danger. Get here now." The call disconnected. I sat in the freezing car, the silence roaring in my ears. "Do not tell your son. Do not tell your daughter-in-law. You are in immediate danger." The words echoed in my skull, repeating like a sinister mantra. My mind began to race furiously, connecting the dots I had deliberately ignored for the past 72 hours. Sylvia was an executive auditor. Her entire professional existence revolved around finding discrepancies, hunting down missing funds, and exposing financial irregularities that others desperately tried to hide. She was brilliant at her job, meticulous to a fault. And Cameron, my entitled, arrogant son, ran a newly launched technology startup that had miraculously secured a massive vendor contract with Croft's logistics firm just 8 months ago. Vanessa worked as a regional director for a pharmaceutical supply firm that handled massive corporate accounts. They had access. They had motive. And suddenly, they had an overwhelming desire to legally incapacitate me and take total control of my assets. I slammed the car into drive and hit the accelerator. The tires spun on the loose gravel before catching traction, propelling me out of the cemetery gates. I merged onto the highway, leading toward the towering skyline of the downtown financial district. The city blurred past my windows, a chaotic smear of gray concrete and flashing brake lights. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The grief that had paralyzed me all morning was entirely consumed by a cold, calculating clarity. If Croft was terrified, then whatever Sylvia had uncovered was monumental. And if my own son was somehow connected to this, I was walking into a war zone completely blind. I navigated the labyrinth of downtown traffic, my eyes constantly darting to the rearview mirror. I checked for any vehicles tailing me, my paranoia completely justified by the chilling warning from a man who commanded billions. I found the hidden entrance to the underground parking garage of the corporate tower. The massive steel door rolled open as I approached the automated security system, recognizing my license plate exactly as Croft had promised. I drove down into the cavernous, brightly lit subterranean level and parked in a secluded VIP bay. A security guard in a dark suit was already waiting for me, his expression grave. He nodded once, checking his earpiece, and escorted me to a sleek, unmarked elevator tucked away behind a frosted glass partition. The doors of the private elevator slid shut silently, sealing me inside a polished steel box. There were no buttons to press, only a biometric scanner that the security guard had activated. The machine began its smooth, rapid ascent to the penthouse executive level. The mechanical hum of the elevator was the only sound, but inside my head, a hurricane was raging. I thought about the 40 years of sweat I had poured into my family. I thought about the thousands of hours I had spent on loading docks, inhaling diesel fumes, and breaking my joints just so Cameron could sit in air-conditioned classrooms and learn how to run a business. I thought about how he had looked at me at the cemetery, treating me not as a grieving father, but as a senile nuisance standing between him and a property deed. And now I was hurtling toward a revelation that threatened to confirm my absolute worst nightmare. The elevator chimed softly. The heavy steel doors parted, revealing a sprawling, immaculate reception area. The executive floor was a fortress of wealth, featuring imported marble floors, minimalist leather furniture, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a dizzying panoramic view of the sprawling metropolis below. The space was completely empty of receptionists or assistants. Croft had obviously cleared the floor for absolute privacy. I stepped out of the elevator, my heavy work boots completely silent on the thick, plush carpet runner that led down the main corridor. I walked slowly, every sense on high alert, navigating the quiet hallway toward the massive frosted glass doors that marked the entrance to Croft's inner sanctum. The lighting was subdued, casting long, dramatic shadows against the walls. As I approached the final intersection before the office, I heard the faint, muffled sound of voices. I instantly halted, pressing my back flat against a thick marble pillar that supported the vaulted ceiling. I held my breath, peering carefully around the cold stone edge. Standing just outside the glass doors of Croft's office were two men. They were speaking in urgent, hushed tones, oblivious to my presence in the shadows. The first man was older, wearing a rumpled gray suit. His posture stooped with an anxious, nervous energy. I recognized him instantly. The shock hit me with the physical force of a sledgehammer. It was Dr. Aris Foster. He was the county medical examiner. The exact same man who had stood in the hospital corridor 3 days ago, looking me directly in the eyes and solemnly declaring that my beloved Sylvia had died instantly from a massive, unpredictable natural aneurysm. My eyes shifted to the second man standing across from the doctor. He was younger, broad-shouldered, wearing an expensive dark overcoat. He had sharp, angular features and a familiar, arrogant stance. It was Trevor. He was Vanessa's older brother. My mind reeled furiously, trying to process the absolute impossibility of this scene. Trevor supposedly lived in Seattle. He was a corporate consultant who practically boasted about never visiting this side of the country. Vanessa had explicitly told me just yesterday that Trevor could not make it to the funeral because he was buried under international contract negotiations. Yet here he was, standing in the executive corridor of my dead wife's workplace, 3 states away from where he was supposed to be. I remained absolutely frozen behind the pillar, not daring to exhale. Trevor reached inside his tailored overcoat and pulled out a thick, unmarked manila envelope. The envelope was heavy, bulging at the seams. He shoved it roughly against Dr. Foster's chest. The medical examiner looked around nervously, his hands trembling violently as he snatched the envelope and quickly stuffed it into his own leather briefcase. "The transaction is complete," Trevor hissed, his voice echoing slightly in the empty corridor. "You ensure the preliminary toxicology samples remain permanently lost in the bureaucratic shuffle. If anyone requests a secondary autopsy, you cite administrative error and cremate the remaining tissue samples. Do you understand me, Doctor?" Dr. Foster swallowed hard, nodding rapidly, sweat glistening on his pale forehead. "I understand. The aneurysm narrative is ironclad. No one is going to question a sudden cardiac event in a 65-year-old woman with a high-stress job. But you tell your sister that this is the absolute last time I cover for her supply chain. I am not risking my medical license again. You will do exactly what you are paid to do, Trevor replied with a cold, menacing sneer. Just walk away and keep your mouth shut. The old man is being put into a locked memory care ward by the end of the week. He does not suspect a thing. Once the court grants Cameron the emergency guardianship, we will liquidate the estate, and all loose ends will be permanently tied up. Trevor turned on his heel and strode purposefully toward the emergency stairwell exit, disappearing behind a heavy fire door. Dr. Foster wiped his brow with a trembling hand, clutched his briefcase tightly against his side, and hurried toward the opposite bank of service elevators. I stood in the shadows, my back pressed hard against the freezing marble pillar. I did not gasp. I did not let out a cry of anguish. I did not chase after them to demand answers. I simply closed my eyes as the horrifying, undeniable truth washed over me, chilling my blood to absolute ice. Sylvia did not die of a natural aneurysm. My beautiful, brilliant wife had not succumbed to a sudden tragedy of failing health. Her death was a calculated, purchased assassination. She had been murdered. And the people who had orchestrated her execution, the people who had paid off a corrupt medical examiner to falsify her death certificate, were the very same people who had stood at her grave this morning, staring at their cell phones. My daughter-in-law and her brother had killed my wife, and my own son Cameron was actively working to declare me legally incompetent to secure the stolen assets. They believed I was a senile, defeated old man. They believed my grief had rendered me weak, pliable, and utterly blind to their treachery. They thought they had successfully executed a flawless corporate elimination and could simply sweep the collateral damage into a nursing home to rot. I opened my eyes. The profound, paralyzing grief that had weighed me down for days was entirely burned away, replaced by a crystalline, terrifying clarity. I was no longer a grieving widower. I was a man who had survived 40 years on the brutal loading docks, a man who knew how to dismantle massive structures piece by piece. I stepped out from behind the marble pillar, my posture straightening, my jaw locking into a rigid line. I did not reach for my phone to call the police. I walked directly toward the heavy glass doors of Lawrence Croft's office, fully prepared to arm myself with the resources of a billionaire and wage a silent, catastrophic war against my own bloodline. The rough concrete of the stairwell wall bit into my shoulders through my coat. I held my breath, listening to the heavy footsteps echoing down the corridor. My chest ached with every beat of my heart, a heavy mechanical thud that felt too loud for the narrow space. I waited until the distinct chime of the service elevator signaled that Dr. Thorne had departed. A moment later, the sharp, confident click of Trevor's expensive shoes faded toward the opposite exit. They were gone. The transaction was complete. The murder of my wife had just been casually filed away in the sterile hallway of a corporate high-rise. I pushed open the heavy fire door. The hinges remained perfectly silent. I stepped back onto the plush carpet of the executive floor, the air suddenly feeling too thin to breathe. I walked straight toward the massive frosted glass doors of the chief executive suite. There was no hesitation left in my bones. 40 years on the loading docks had taught me how to brace for an impact, how to lock my joints before a heavy pallet dropped. I was locking my joints now. I pushed the glass doors open and stepped into the sprawling office. The room was dark, illuminated only by the sprawling city lights filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Lawrence Croft sat behind a vast mahogany desk. He looked nothing like the untouchable billionaire I had seen in magazines. His tie was discarded, his collar unbuttoned, and his face was drawn tight, with a mixture of exhaustion and raw panic. He did not offer a polite greeting. He did not offer me a seat. He simply stared at me with eyes that had seen too much. "Lock the door behind you, Douglas," Croft commanded, his voice devoid of any corporate polish. I turned the heavy deadbolt until it clicked solidly into place. The finality of that sound sealed us inside. I approached the mahogany desk. Croft did not bother with condolences. We were far beyond the realm of sympathy. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a thick black folder. He slid it across the polished wood. It stopped precisely at the edge, inches from my calloused hands. I took the folder. The paper felt heavy, loaded with a truth that was about to obliterate whatever remained of my family. "Open it," Croft said softly. I flipped the cover back. Inside was a dense, highly technical medical document stamped with the insignia of a private independent laboratory. I scanned the lines of chemical compounds, molecular weights, and absorption rates. I did not possess a medical degree, but I knew how to read an inventory manifest. I knew how to spot an anomaly in a ledger. Sylvia did not suffer an aneurysm. Croft stated, his voice cutting through the quiet room like a scalpel. She was murdered, Douglas, and it was executed with terrifying precision. I stared at the black ink on the page. My eyes tracked the chemical terms, searching for an anchor. "What am I looking at, Mr. Croft?" I asked, my voice remaining completely steady, betraying none of the acid burning in my throat. "When Sylvia collapsed in her office 3 days ago," Croft explained, leaning forward, resting his elbows on the desk, "the building paramedics were the first to respond. By the time they reached her, her heart had already stopped. The county medical examiner, Dr. Thorne, took custody of her body almost immediately. He ruled it a massive, unpredictable cerebral event, a natural tragedy. But Sylvia had triggered a silent corporate distress beacon from her terminal exactly 4 minutes before she died. She knew someone was coming for her. My grip tightened on the edge of the folder. A distress beacon. My wife had spent her final moments completely alone, knowing she was being hunted in her own workplace. Because of that beacon, Croft continued, his eyes locking onto mine, I enacted our extreme internal security protocols. Before Dr. Thorne could transport her to the county morgue, my private medical team extracted several vials of her blood under the guise of an emergency post-mortem corporate liability test. We bypassed the county entirely and sent those vials to an independent toxicologist in Switzerland. That report in your hands is the result. I looked down at the highlighted section near the bottom of the second page. A specific chemical compound was circled in bright red ink. "They found a synthetic neurotoxin in her bloodstream," Croft said, his tone icy. "It is an incredibly rare, highly volatile muscle relaxant designed for severe neurological trauma. In microdoses, it paralyzes the nervous system. In the concentration they found in Sylvia, it causes immediate catastrophic arterial failure. It flawlessly mimics a massive aneurysm. It leaves the system entirely within 12 hours. If we had not drawn her blood in those first few minutes, the toxin would have vanished completely." Thorne knew this. He just had to delay the autopsy until the chemical degraded. I absorbed the words, a synthetic neurotoxin. This was not a crime of passion. This was not a spontaneous act of violence. This was a calculated, sterile elimination. It required access. It required specific, highly restricted knowledge. "Where does something like this even come from?" I asked, looking up at Croft. "A chemical that's specialized cannot just be purchased off the street." Well, Croft nodded slowly, acknowledging the horrifying trajectory of my logic. "You are absolutely right, Douglas. It cannot be purchased off the street. It is a proprietary compound. It is heavily restricted by the federal government, used only in highly specialized experimental treatments. There are only a handful of distributors in the entire country authorized to transport and handle this specific neurotoxin." He paused, letting the silence stretch between us. The air in the office grew suffocatingly dense. I felt the phantom weight of the keys I had handed my son at the cemetery pressing against my memory. "There is only one firm in this entire region that has the distribution rights to that chemical," Croft finally said. I did not need him to finish the sentence. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with a sickening, violent force. The realization hit me so hard my knees nearly buckled, but 40 years of carrying impossible loads kept me standing upright. I stared at the dark skyline beyond the glass, seeing nothing but the cruel, arrogant face of my daughter-in-law standing over my wife's grave, texting on her phone. "Vanessa," I whispered the name, tasting like ash on my tongue. Croft nodded, once his expression grim. "Vanessa is the regional supply director for Apex Pharmaceuticals. She holds the highest level clearance for their restricted chemical vaults. She is the only person in a 500-mile radius with the logistical authority to bypass the tracking software, secure a lethal dose of that neurotoxin, and walk out the door without triggering a single alarm. The room seemed to shrink. The daughter-in-law I had welcomed into my home, the woman I had shared. Thanksgiving dinners with the woman who complained about my failing memory just hours ago had procured the poison that stopped my wife's heart. And her brother Trevor was the bagman paying off the medical examiner to look the other way. But why, I asked, the sheer incomprehensibility of the motive threatening to overwhelm my logic. Why go to such extreme, terrifying lengths to kill an executive auditor? What could Sylvia have possibly found that warranted a corporate assassination? Croft leaned back in his leather chair. He looked older than his years, carrying the burden of a man who realized his empire had been compromised from the inside out. That brings us to your son, Douglas. The mention of Cameron sent a fresh wave of nausea through my system. I remembered his tailored suit. I remembered his absolute refusal to look at his mother's casket. I remembered the cold, eager demand for the deed to my house. Croft opened a second drawer and withdrew a sleek silver tablet device. He placed it carefully on the desk. Sylvia was not just auditing our external shipping manifests, he explained. She had initiated a deep dive into our secondary vendor contracts, specifically the new software integration contracts. 8 months ago, Cameron's technology startup miraculously won a massive bid to upgrade our entire logistical tracking framework. I remember, I said quietly. He bragged about it for weeks. He said it was the contract that was going to put his company on the map. He said he finally earned his seat at the adult table. He did not earn anything, Croft corrected sharply. He manufactured an illusion. Sylvia discovered that his software does absolutely nothing. It is a hollow shell program. It provides dummy data to our servers while actively creating backdoors into our financial network. Croft tapped the screen of the tablet. An encrypted audio file appeared on the display. Sylvia left this voicemail on my secure private server at 2 a.m. the night before she was killed. I want you to hear it from her. He pressed play. The quiet hiss of static filled the room, followed immediately by Sylvia's voice. Hearing her alive, hearing the urgent, exhausted timbre of the woman I loved, nearly broke my resolve. But I locked my jaw, forcing myself to listen to every syllable. Mr. Croft. Sylvia's recorded voice began, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. I have found the leak. It is worse than we thought. The integration software provided by Cameron's firm is a Trojan horse. They are actively siphoning funds from the European transit accounts. They have already moved over $4 million. But Lawrence, they are not hiding it offshore. They are routing the stolen capital through a secondary proxy. They are funneling the embezzled money directly into my husband's private retirement accounts. The recording stopped. The silence rushed back in, heavier and more dangerous than before. I stood absolutely perfectly still. The magnitude of the betrayal was so vast, so utterly encompassing, it defied human comprehension. They were not just stealing money from a billionaire. They were framing me for the theft. Sylvia was going to bring this to the federal authorities the next morning, Croft said quietly. She had all the ledger proofs. She had the routing numbers. She was going to expose the entire operation to save you from taking the fall. Vanessa caught wind of the audit. She used her pharmaceutical access to silence Sylvia before she could make the drop. And now Cameron needs complete legal control over your life to access those retirement accounts and move the stolen $4 million before my security teams trace the missing funds back to his fake software firm. The puzzle was finally complete. Every arrogant smirk, every demand for the house deed, every fake concern about my failing memory. It was all a meticulously constructed narrative designed to declare me legally incompetent. If I was locked away in a memory care facility stripped of my financial autonomy, Cameron would gain total control over the accounts holding the stolen millions. They killed my wife to protect their theft, and they were going to bury me alive to secure the cash. Douglas Croft said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. They are coming for you next. If they get that guardianship, you will disappear into a locked ward and you will never see the light of day again. We need to go to the federal authorities right now. I looked down at the black folder containing the toxicology report. I looked at the silver tablet holding my wife's final desperate attempt to save my life. I thought about Cameron and Vanessa standing over Sylvia's grave, texting on their phones, utterly secure in their absolute victory. Going to the authorities right now will just tip them off, I said, my voice shockingly calm. They will destroy the remaining evidence. Trevor will vanish. Dr. Thorne will deny everything. They will claim Sylvia was confused and that the money was a legitimate transfer. They will drag this out in the courts for a decade. Croft stood up, placing his hands flat on the desk. So what exactly are you proposing, Douglas? I reached across the mahogany desk and closed the black folder. I slid it back toward Croft. I am proposing we let them think they have won, I replied, staring directly into the eyes of the billionaire. Let them think I am a broken, confused old man. Let them try to take my house. Let them file their guardianship papers. We are going to use their own arrogance to build a trap they can never escape. Keep your security team on standby, I instructed Croft, my voice echoing with a newfound authority. Monitor the network for any abnormal access requests tied to my personal data. I am going back to the house. I am going to let them play their hand. Douglas Croft warned, stepping out from behind his desk. You are walking into a house with a woman who possesses untraceable neurotoxins. If Vanessa suspects for even a fraction of a second that you know the truth, she will not hesitate to silence you, just like she silenced Sylvia. She will not suspect a thing, I promised, gripping the handle of the glass door. She expects to see a defeated, exhausted old man who cannot remember where he left his house keys. I am going to give her exactly the performance she wants. I will play the perfect victim until the exact moment they hang themselves with their own ambition. I stepped out of the executive suite and let the heavy door swing shut, the click of the latch echoing down the empty corridor. The journey back to my car was a blur of calculated focus. The man who had wept at the cemetery was dead. The man who rode the elevator down to the subterranean parking garage was a phantom, a silent architect preparing to execute a flawless, catastrophic demolition. I started the engine of my aging sedan and drove out into the city, heading straight toward the very people who were actively plotting my total annihilation. The gravel driveway of my home was completely dark when the headlights of the old sedan swept across the front porch. The house looked dark from the street, but as I crept closer, I could see a faint yellow light bleeding through the heavy velvet curtains of Sylvia's second-floor office. This was the house I had bought in 1992 after working consecutive 16-hour shifts at the freight terminal, moving heavy cargo until my spine felt on fire. I had proudly paid off the 30-year mortgage 3 months early just to surprise Sylvia on our anniversary. Now it looked like a tomb occupied by thieves. I parked the car down by the curb, hiding it out of sight behind the large overgrown branches of the old maple tree. My joints were stiff from the freezing cemetery wind, but the cold numbness in my calloused hands had been completely replaced by a low burning heat. I walked up the wooden porch steps, my boots feeling incredibly heavy. I pulled the large ring of house keys out of my trousers out of pure 40-year habit, even though I had already surrendered my primary set to Cameron at the graveside. I selected the heavy brass front door key and slid it into the lock mechanism. It refused to turn. It did not even catch the internal tumblers. I pulled the key back out and ran my thumb over the brass faceplate of the lock cylinder. It was completely cold, clean, and new. They had replaced the entire deadbolt mechanism during the short 3 hours I had spent in the city, listening to Lawrence Croft reveal the true cause of my wife's death. They did not even wait for the funeral flowers to wither before locks were changed. The conflict was chaining forward exactly as the billionaire CEO had predicted. They were locking the cage from the outside before I could even realize I was being targeted as a prisoner. I did not rattle the brass doorknob. I did not yell into the empty, quiet street to alert the neighbors. I stepped down off the porch, moving silently into the deep shadows of the side yard, where the grass was long and damp. Years ago, when Cameron was a careless teenager who constantly lost his house keys after football practice, I had wired an emergency electronic bypass code into the old overhead garage door keypad. It was an independent hardwired circuit that entirely bypassed the home's main security panel. Cameron had dismissed it as ancient, obsolete technology when he moved out to his luxury downtown condo, but I had never removed it. I pulled back the faded, cracked plastic cover of the keypad and firmly punched in the 6 digits of Sylvia's birth date. The mechanical gears deep within the frame groaned, and the small side utility door clicked open. I stepped into the mudroom, the familiar scent of cedar wood wax and old laundry detergent filling my nose, but the sanctuary was violated by something else. The sharp, synthetic floral scent of Vanessa's expensive perfume hung heavy in the air. I slipped off my heavy boots, walking in my socks across the polished hardwood floor of the kitchen. Every single floorboard in this house had a specific voice, and after 40 years, I knew exactly where to place my weight to avoid the loud creaks. I had installed these oak planks myself in the summer of '98, while Cameron sat on the kitchen counter complaining that we did not live in a brand new modern subdivision like his wealthy school friends. I glided through the darkened dining room and stood at the base of the grand wooden staircase. From the top of the landing, the muffled sounds of destruction drifted down the hallway. I could hear the aggressive tearing of cardboard boxes and the heavy structural thuds of dresser drawers being pulled completely out of their tracking channels. I climbed the stairs, keeping my weight pressed firmly against the outer wall, where the timber framing was heavily reinforced. The chaotic noise was coming directly from Sylvia's home office. The solid wood door was left half open, casting a jagged wedge of harsh white light across the hallway carpet. I leaned in close to the gap, my eyes focusing through the narrow opening. The room was in absolute ruin. Sylvia had always kept her office meticulously organized, every corporate audit folder alphabetized, every bank ledger categorized chronologically by fiscal quarter. Now her entire life's work was scattered across the hardwood floor like garbage. Vanessa was on her knees in front of the built-in oak bookshelves, frantically ripping the linen linings out of the storage baskets and throwing old tax folders over her shoulder. Her expensive black dress was smudged with white drywall dust, but her face was locked in an expression of rabid, uncontrolled desperation. Cameron was standing directly at Sylvia's desk, using a heavy steel screwdriver to violently wedge open the locked lower filing drawer, where she kept her personal journals and original bank records. "Where is the encrypted drive?" Vanessa asked, her voice breathless, sharp, and furious, as she shredded another cardboard storage file. The medical examiner said she kept a physical hard copy backup of the logistics company ledger somewhere in this house. If the federal investigators trace those corporate transit wires before we can clean the primary server databases, we are completely done. Cameron slammed the screwdriver into the mahogany wood with a loud splintering crack, destroying the grain I had spent 3 weeks polishing by hand for her wedding anniversary gift. "Next time I will buy something cheaper," he muttered. "Shut up and keep looking, Vanessa." He snapped his forehead slick with sweat. My mother was completely obsessive about paper trails. If she found the backdoor code I used, she definitely wrote down the recovery keys somewhere tangible, because she never trusted cloud storage servers. Check the back of the family picture frames. My blood was boiling so violently I could feel the rapid pulse drumming hard behind my ears. I wanted to step through that open door and wrap my calloused hands around his throat. I wanted to scream at him for violating the sacred memory of the woman who had nurtured, protected, and funded him his entire life. But the horrific images of the medical examiner accepting the unmarked envelope and the toxicologist report flashed in my mind. If I fought them openly now, they would immediately use the emergency guardianship petition to lock me away in a mental facility before the toxicologist could ever testify in court. I needed to chain the conflict forward on my own terms. I needed to become the fragile, broken old man they assumed I was. I took a deep, ragged breath and forced a loud, wet, hacking cough from the very back of my throat. I allowed my knees to loosen intentionally, slamming my shoulder hard against the drywall of the outer hallway to make the entry clumsy and loud. The frantic noise inside the room stopped instantly. The silence that followed was total. I stumbled into the open doorway, clutching my chest with a trembling hand, my eyes wide and deliberately vacant. I leaned heavily against the oak doorframe, letting my jaw slacken slightly as I looked at the absolute chaos around the room. Cameron and Vanessa snapped around their faces, draining of color, as they experienced an absolute primal panic. Cameron dropped the heavy screwdriver onto the desktop, the metal clattering loudly against the ruined mahogany. Vanessa scrambled back onto her feet, trying to use her long black dress to hide the shredded storage baskets scattered on the carpet behind her. "Dad." Cameron stammered, his voice pitching an octave higher as he tried to force a reassuring smile onto his pale face. "You are back early from the cemetery. We thought you went to the memorial reception at the church with the other guests." I did not look at him directly. I kept my gaze drifting aimlessly across the white papers on the floor, perfectly mimicking the unfocused, disoriented stare of a dementia patient. "My keys," I mumbled, allowing my voice to tremble with a fragile, raspy weakness that sounded entirely broken. I went to the front door, but the key would not fit into the cylinder. "The key did not work, Cameron. I thought I forgot how to use the lock. I thought my mind was playing tricks again." "Cameron, where are my keys?" Vanessa exchanged a rapid, loaded glance with her husband across the room. The initial panic on her face faded in an instant, replaced by a cold, dismissive, and superior smugness. She stepped forward, brushing a layer of dust off her black silk skirt, her voice dripping with a fake, honeyed warmth that made my stomach tighten with revulsion. "Oh, Douglas, honey," she said, walking slowly toward me, with her hands outstretched, as if approaching a frightened animal. "Don't worry about the keys at all. Remember, we talked about this exact issue at the cemetery. The front door lock was completely broken and sticking. Cameron had the neighborhood handyman come out and replace the entire mechanism this afternoon to keep you safe. We did it so no random intruders could just walk in on you while you were downstairs resting." "Safe," I repeated, letting my voice trail off into a hollow, empty whisper. I looked down at a scattered stack of Sylvia's old financial corporate audits near my feet. "Why are all her papers on the floor, Cameron? Did the wind blow them down from the window?" Cameron stepped out from behind the desk, his confidence returning fully as he saw how thoroughly pathetic and helpless I appeared in the doorway. He walked over and took my arm, his grip firm and tight, despite pretending to be gentle. "Yeah, Dad. The wind must have caught the old window sash while we were downstairs. We came up here to close it and decided we should start organizing Mom's old things for you. We didn't want you to have to walk in here and look at all these painful reminders of her loss. It is simply too much emotional stress for your heart right now." "You are organizing them," I said, allowing him to guide me slowly out of the doorway, away from the splintered mahogany drawer. I looked back at Vanessa over my shoulder. Her sharp eyes were scanning my face, searching intensely for any crack in my performance. I allowed a single genuine tear of rage to escape my eye, letting it look like helpless grief to their eyes. "She was always so neat, Cameron." Sylvia hated when things were out of order in her office. "We know, Douglas," Vanessa said, patting my calloused arm with her freezing, slim fingers. "Why don't you go down to the kitchen right now and let me make you some hot chamomile tea? You look so exhausted and completely confused by the day. We will finish up organizing these old files and join you downstairs in a few minutes." I nodded slowly, letting my shoulders slump heavily as I turned away toward the staircase. I babbled something incoherent about needing to find my slippers, leaving them alone in the ruined room. But as I walked down the wooden steps, completely out of their line of sight, my fragile posture vanished into absolute iron. The conflict had chained precisely into place. They believed they had caged a senile old fool. They had no earthly idea they had just let the executioner back into the house. The morning after the break-in was the beginning of my greatest performance. I woke up before dawn. I did not get out of bed with the rigid discipline I had maintained for 40 years. Instead, I lay there staring at the ceiling and practiced making my hands shake. I practiced the vacant, confused stare I had seen on the faces of the truly lost. When I finally walked downstairs, I made sure to drag my feet. I let my slippers scuff against the hardwood floor, creating the pathetic shuffling sound of a man whose body and mind were giving up. Cameron and Vanessa were already in the kitchen. They stopped talking the exact moment I entered. I looked at the coffee maker, and then looked at Cameron blinking slowly, as if trying to remember how the machine worked. Vanessa immediately stepped into the role of the devoted caregiver. She wore a pristine white apron over her expensive clothes. Her smile was so bright, it made my stomach turn. She guided me to the kitchen table with a gentle hand that felt like a freezing clamp on my forearm. "Sit down, Douglas," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "I am making you a special breakfast. You just need to rest and let us take care of everything." I sat down and nodded weakly. Inside my shirt pocket, nestled tightly against my chest, were 3 sterile medical vials Croft had given me the night before. They were tiny glass tubes with rubber stoppers. As Vanessa turned her back to flip the eggs, I carefully unscrewed the cap of one vial with one hand, keeping it hidden beneath the table. She placed a plate of food in front of me. The smell of the eggs and toast was completely normal, but I knew I was looking at a loaded weapon. I waited for her to turn toward the sink to wash the pan. In that brief window of opportunity, I scooped a small portion of the eggs into the glass vial, pressed the rubber stopper in, and slipped it back into my pocket. I then mashed the rest of the food around on my plate to make it look half-eaten. This became our nightly ritual. Every single dinner was a high-stakes game of Russian roulette, played in absolute silence. Vanessa would prepare heavy, rich meals like meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and thick stews. She would plate the food and set it before me, pouring me a glass of water with a terrifyingly sweet smile. "Eat up, Douglas," she would coax, standing over me like a warden. "You are looking so terribly thin lately." I would force my hands to tremble as I picked up my fork. I would drop peas onto the table. I would spill water on my chin. I swallowed my pride completely, letting her wipe my face with a napkin, while she exchanged triumphant smirks with my son across the table. But the moment their attention shifted, the moment Cameron looked at his phone, or Vanessa reached for the salt shaker, I moved with the lightning speed of a dock worker. A spoonful of gravy went into the second vial. A chunk of meatloaf went into the third. I hid them in my pockets, my socks, and the cuffs of my sleeves. I was a magician, performing the most dangerous trick of my life, right in front of my executioners. The food was only half the battle. The real warfare was psychological. I had to convince Cameron that my mind was rapidly dissolving into mush, so he would feel utterly confident in his plan to take my assets. I started asking questions about Sylvia, as if I had forgotten she was dead. I would walk into the living room where Cameron was working on his laptop and look around, confused. "Cameron," I would say, letting my voice waver. "Is your mother working late at the corporate office again? I cannot find her coat in the closet." Cameron would slam his laptop shut and stare at me with pure, unadulterated disgust. "Dad," he would snap, his voice tight with engineered frustration. "Mom is gone. We buried her last week. Are you seriously forgetting this again?" I would stagger backward, clutching my chest, and let out a pathetic, whimpering sound. "I am sorry," I would mumble, looking at the floor. "My head is just so foggy today. I cannot seem to keep my thoughts straight." He loved it. I could see the greedy satisfaction burning behind his eyes every time I diminished myself. He fed on my fake weakness. He began speaking to me as if I were a deaf imbecile. He would loudly announce that he was paying the utility bills because I was clearly too incompetent to handle basic math. He would snatch the mail out of my hands, claiming he needed to protect me from scammers. Every insult, every degrading comment was a log thrown onto the raging fire in my chest. But I swallowed the smoke. I let him talk down to me. I let him push me into corners because I needed him to feel absolutely invincible. I needed him to believe he was the smartest man in the room. By the end of the week, the tension in the house was razor sharp. The vials were safely handed off to Croft during my supposed daily walks to the neighborhood park. I was ready to spring the next phase of the trap. I needed Cameron to put his arrogance on the record. I needed him to verbally tie himself to the corporate accounts before he ever filed the guardianship papers. I walked into the dining room on a Thursday evening. Cameron was sitting at the large oak table surrounded by printed spreadsheets and bank statements. He was furiously typing into his laptop, completely absorbed in his stolen empire. I reached into my chest pocket and pressed the record button on my smartphone, leaving the microphone exposed perfectly through the thin fabric of my flannel shirt. I shuffled toward this table, dragging my feet. "Cameron," I said, my voice high and confused. "I got a letter from the bank today. They said something about a massive transfer. Did you move my retirement money? I thought I had a few $1,000s in there, but the paper said millions. I do not understand these numbers at all." Cameron did not even look up from his screen. He scoffed loudly, his fingers hammering the keyboard. "You do not need to understand the numbers, Dad. That is exactly why I am taking over the finances. You are looking at a holding matrix, not a standard checking account." I leaned closer to the table, letting my hands shake violently against the wood. But the letter said the money came from Crofts Logistics Company. "Why is Crofts' money in my retirement account, Cameron? Did you make a mistake with the software billing?" That was the trigger. I challenged his intelligence, and his ego simply could not resist taking the bait. He finally stopped typing and slammed his hands down flat on the table, glaring up at me with sheer contempt. "There is no mistake, you doddering old fool," he spat, his voice echoing loudly in the dining room, perfectly captured by the microphone in my pocket. "My software integration is flawless. It is a masterpiece. I set up an automated proxy routing system that pulls directly from Crofts' European transit accounts. It bypasses his entire security protocol because the dummy data I feed his servers matches the outgoing balance." I blinked rapidly, stepping back and clutching my head, as if the information was physically hurting my brain. "But why is it in my name?" I whined, sounding completely terrified. "If it is your money, why did you put it in my bank?" Cameron laughed, a cold, hollow sound that lacked any shred of humanity. "Because you are the ultimate firewall, Dad. The money sits in your account as pending capital. To the federal investigators, it looks like a confused, retired freight manager somehow stumbled into a massive offshore wire transfer. But you cannot touch it, and Croft cannot find it. By the time anyone figures out the money is actually missing, I will have the emergency medical guardianship signed by a judge. I will have the legal authority to authorize the transfer out of your account into my offshore holding firms. The money vanishes, and you take the absolute blame if the feds ever come knocking. It is a foolproof closed-loop system, and there is absolutely nothing anyone can do to stop it." I let my jaw drop open, staring at him in mock horror. "You are stealing from your mother's boss," I gasped perfectly, playing the role of a devastated, broken parent. "Cameron, you are going to go to jail. They will lock you away." Cameron stood up from the table, towering over my hunched frame. He leaned in close, his face inches from mine, smelling of mint and pure greed. "Nobody is going to jail, except maybe you, if you do not shut your mouth and sit down," he whispered menacingly. "You do not understand how the real world works anymore, Dad. You are losing your mind. You cannot even remember where you put your shoes. You are going to sign the medical power of attorney tomorrow morning, and then you are going to a very nice facility where they can medicate you properly. Do not fight me on this, or I swear to God I will make sure they put you in a ward where they strap you to a bed." I looked down at the floor, letting my shoulders collapse completely. I nodded slowly, playing the utterly defeated victim. "Okay, Cameron," I whispered submissively. "Okay. I do not understand any of this. I just want to rest." "Go to your room, Dad," he commanded, pointing toward the stairs. "I will handle the rest." I turned and shuffled slowly out of the dining room, dragging my feet against the floorboards. I kept my head bowed and my hands trembling until I reached the top of the stairs and closed my bedroom door behind me. The moment the latch clicked shut, my trembling vanished. I stood up perfectly straight. I reached into my pocket and stopped the recording. I played the audio file back, listening to the crisp, clear sound of my son detailing his entire federal wire fraud operation and his explicit intent to frame me. He had just handed me the absolute weapon of his own destruction. I smiled in the dark, a cold, hard expression that had nothing to do with joy. The trap was set. The bait was taken. Now all I had to do was wait for the jaws to snap shut. The crisp morning air bit at my face as I shuffled down the concrete sidewalk toward the municipal park. I dragged my left foot slightly, letting the sole of my shoe scrape against the pavement. I kept my shoulders rounded and my head bowed perfectly, portraying the hollow shell of a man broken by grief. I reached the park and found my designated spot on a weathered wooden bench facing the duck pond. I sat down heavily, letting out a long, trembling breath. 5 minutes later, a sleek black town car pulled up to the curb. A man stepped out. He did not look like he belonged in a public park. He wore an immaculate, tailored charcoal suit, and his silver hair was combed back with flawless precision. This was Gordon Reed, the most ruthless corporate defense attorney on Lawrence Croft's payroll. Reed did not walk, he glided across the grass with the silent, predatory grace of a shark. He sat down on the far end of my bench. He did not look at me. He opened a copy of a financial newspaper and stared straight ahead at the water. "The weather is turning foul." "Douglas," he said, his voice a low, gravelly hum that barely carried over the wind. "We have very little time before your son completely detonates your financial infrastructure." I kept my eyes fixed on the pond, tearing a piece of stale bread and tossing it to the birds. "What did your forensic accountants find?" I asked, my voice steady and cold. Reed turned a page of his newspaper. "Your daughter-in-law has been exceptionally busy. She utilized her corporate pharmaceutical contacts to acquire highly sophisticated identity verification software. Over the past 3 weeks while your wife was still alive, Vanessa systematically bypassed your personal banking security questions. She established 4 separate lines of revolving credit entirely under your name. The total currently stands at $150,000. She leveraged the remaining equity in your home to secure the loans." The words struck me with the force of a physical blow. I stopped tearing the bread. Vanessa had not just planned to kill my wife and lock me away. She was actively cannibalizing my life while I was still living in it. She was draining the blood from my veins before the carcass was even cold. "What did she buy?" I demanded, feeling a profound disgust rising in my throat. "She did not buy luxury handbags or vacations." Reed replied, his tone dripping with professional contempt. "She used the credit lines to pay off exorbitant debts incurred by Cameron's failing technology startup. She covered payroll for his dummy corporation and paid retaining fees to offshore proxy servers. They are using your stolen credit to fund the very infrastructure they built to embezzle the $4 million from Croft. If you die tomorrow, or if you are committed to a psychiatric ward, the bank seizes your house to cover the debt." Cameron walks away completely unburdened, and his fake company stays operational long enough to secure the stolen corporate funds. The sheer comprehensive evil of their strategy was breathtaking. They had turned my entire existence into a disposable utility. They assumed I was a poor, retired freight manager with nothing to my name but a modest house and a meager pension. They assumed I would be an easy target. But they had fundamentally misunderstood who I was, and they had completely underestimated the brilliant foresight of the woman they had murdered. "Sylvia was an executive auditor," I said quietly, my voice laced with a dangerous calm. "She spent her life hunting hidden money. She knew the logistics industry was volatile, and she knew we needed a fortress that no one could ever breach." Reed paused, his hands gripping the edges of his newspaper. "What are you telling me, Douglas?" I looked down at my scarred, calloused hands. For 40 years, Cameron mocked our lifestyle. He laughed at my old truck. He ridiculed his mother for buying clothes on clearance. He hated us for being ordinary middle-class workers. He thought we were cheap. He never bothered to look beneath the surface. Sylvia and I lived on a fraction of our income. Every bonus, every stock dividend, every drop of overtime pay was aggressively diverted into decentralized private investment portfolios. We built a shadow estate completely detached from our primary banking identity. I turned my head slightly to look at the ruthless attorney. I am not a poor man, Mr. Reed. Sylvia and I amassed a liquid fortune of nearly $3 million. It is currently sitting in a series of unlisted municipal bonds and obscure mutual funds. Cameron has absolutely no idea it exists because his arrogance blinds him to anything that does not loudly announce its own value. For the first time since sitting down, Reed looked directly at me. A slow, sharp smile spread across his face. You are holding $3 million in untraceable assets, and your son is currently destroying his life to steal a house he thinks is your only possession. That is exactly right, I said. But if Cameron successfully acquires medical and financial power of attorney over me next week, he will gain the legal right to run a comprehensive Social Security audit. He will eventually uncover those accounts. I need that money permanently, surgically removed from my name. I need it to disappear so completely that not even a federal subpoena could link it back to Douglas Pierce. Reed reached into his leather briefcase resting on the bench beside him. He pulled out a thick stack of documents bound in a heavy blue folder. He slid the folder across the wooden slats until it touched my thigh. I anticipated we would need to build a defensive perimeter around your existing assets, Reed said, his tone returning to rapid professional efficiency. This is an irrevocable blind trust. It is the legal equivalent of a black hole. Once you sign these affidavits, every single cent you own will be instantly transferred into this corporate entity. I will be the sole managing executor. You will hold zero legal claim to the funds. Cameron can forge all the signatures he wants. He can drag you before a judge and have you declared totally insane. It will not matter. He cannot steal what legally does not exist. I picked up the blue folder. The weight of the paper felt like absolute salvation. If I signed these documents, I was effectively rendering myself a penniless ward of the state on paper. I was surrendering my life savings to a man I had known for less than 48 hours. But the alternative was surrendering my legacy to the monsters who had poisoned my wife. I pulled a cheap plastic pen from my coat pocket. I did not hesitate. I did not read the dense legal jargon because I knew Croft had engineered this explicitly to crush Cameron. I flipped to the signature pages and pressed the pen hard against the paper. I signed my name, releasing the bonds, releasing the mutual funds, releasing 40 years of blood and sweat into the protective darkness of the blind trust. I closed the folder and slid it back across the bench. It is done, I said. Douglas Pierce now officially owns absolutely nothing but a house crippled by $150,000 of fraudulent debt. Reed placed the folder back into his briefcase, snapping the brass locks shut with a sharp, definitive click. The execution was flawless, but the reality of the situation rapidly chilled the air between us. You have secured the perimeter, Douglas Reed warned, his voice hardening into a grim, tactical register. But you have also drastically accelerated their timeline. I frowned, keeping my eyes on the pond. What do you mean? My forensic team discovered that Vanessa maxed out the final line of credit yesterday afternoon, Reed explained. There is no more equity to drain from your house. Their dummy corporation is bleeding cash, and they desperately need to finalize the $4 million embezzlement from Croft. But they cannot move that stolen money until they secure your proxy signature through the guardianship. I gripped the edge of the wooden bench, understanding exactly where his logic was leading. They are out of stolen funds, exactly, Reed said. They are out of money and they are out of time. They can no longer afford to wait for you to slowly decline. They need you incapacitated immediately so they can petition the emergency court for total control. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine that had nothing to do with the freezing wind. They are going to stop playing games, I whispered. They are going to move in for the kill, Reed confirmed, his eyes narrowing. Vanessa is a supply director for a major pharmaceutical distributor. She has access to a limitless arsenal of chemical compounds. If she used a synthetic neurotoxin on your wife, she will undoubtedly use a chemical agent on you. She will not kill you outright, because they need you alive for the judge. But she will dose you with something designed to completely obliterate your cognitive functions. She is going to manufacture the symptoms of advanced dementia so violently and so rapidly that any attending physician will instantly sign the commitment papers. I stared at the water, watching a lone duck glide across the dark surface. My own family was actively preparing to poison my food. They were planning to chemically lobotomize me in my own dining room. The profound evil of their strategy was almost too massive to process, but I refused to let fear conquer my mind. "Let them try," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous feral pitch. Reed reached into his inside jacket pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. He placed it carefully on my lap. "These are medical-grade sterile sample vials," he instructed. "Croft secured them from our private laboratory. Whenever Vanessa serves you a meal or brings you a drink, you must covertly extract a sample and secure it in one of these vials. Do not consume anything she hands you directly. You must feign the symptoms she expects to see while secretly gathering the physical evidence of her crime. We need proof of the poisoning to completely destroy their guardianship petition in open court." I took the velvet pouch, feeling the small glass tubes clicking together through the fabric. I slipped the pouch deep into my coat pocket, resting it directly over my heart. "I will get the samples I promised." Reed stood up, smoothing the front of his charcoal suit. The town car engine roared to life behind us. "You are walking back into a highly toxic environment, Douglas. You must embrace total submission. You must let them treat you like dirt. Let Cameron speak to you with absolute condescension. Let Vanessa think she is successfully breaking your mind. The moment you show a single spark of intelligence, they will panic and escalate to lethal force. I know how to play the victim," I said, standing up slowly, letting my shoulders round forward as I slipped back into my fragile disguise. "I have been playing the obedient, silent father my entire life." Reed gave me one final measuring look before turning away. "We will communicate exclusively through the dead drop at this park bench. Do not call my office. Do not call Croft. Bring me the vials." Reed walked across the grass and climbed into the back of the black town car. The vehicle pulled away, merging seamlessly into the city traffic until it vanished completely. I was entirely alone again in the freezing park. I had just signed away $3 million. I was returning to a house occupied by assassins. I turned and began the slow, shuffling walk back to the neighborhood, dragging my left foot against the concrete. I was a ghost, walking toward a haunted house, ready to let the monsters believe they were winning the war. The freezing wind whipped across the municipal park, tearing dead leaves from the branches as I shuffled toward my designated bench. I dragged my left foot, maintaining the pathetic facade of a broken man, even when I was entirely alone. You never knew who was watching. 5 minutes later, the familiar black town car slid up to the curb. Gordon Reed stepped out, moving with the same predatory grace, holding a manila envelope tightly against his charcoal suit. He sat beside me on the freezing wood, staring straight ahead at the gray water of the duck pond. He did not bother with pleasantries. The results from the sterile vials came back from Croft's independent laboratory. "This morning," he said, his voice a low vibration that barely registered above the wind. "You need to listen to me very carefully, Douglas, because your physical survival is now in active jeopardy." I kept my eyes on this water, tossing a handful of breadcrumbs to the ducks. "Tell me what she is feeding me," I commanded, my voice perfectly steady, despite the sudden spike of adrenaline in my chest. Reed opened the envelope just enough to slide a single sheet of paper onto my lap. "It is a highly synthesized muscle relaxant," he explained. "It is a derivative of the same neurotoxin they used to stop Sylvia's heart, but it has been heavily diluted and chemically altered for long-term ingestion. Vanessa is not trying to kill you outright. She is systematically dosing your food to chemically manufacture the exact clinical symptoms of advanced dementia. The compound crosses the blood-brain barrier and suppresses your acetylcholine levels. It causes extreme short-term memory loss, severe motor function impairment, slurred speech, and severe lethargy." The words settled over me like a heavy shroud of ice. I stared at the clinical chemical breakdown printed on the paper. The tremors in my hands, the sudden bouts of exhaustion, the heavy brain fog I had been fighting for the past 5 days. I had assumed it was the crushing weight of grief combined with the sheer stress of my performance. But it was not just acting. I was actually being poisoned. My own daughter-in-law was standing in my kitchen wearing a pristine white apron, smiling warmly as she deliberately laced my meatloaf with a chemical designed to lobotomize me. I thought back to a Thanksgiving dinner 3 years ago. Sylvia had politely refused to eat a single bite of the casseroles Vanessa had brought to the house, claiming she had a sudden stomach bug. Later that night, in the quiet safety of our bedroom, Sylvia had whispered to me that there was something inherently toxic about Vanessa, something she could not quite prove but felt deep in her bones. My brilliant wife had sensed the poison in that woman, long before it was ever poured onto a plate. I should have listened to her. I should have banned Cameron and his treacherous wife from our home the moment those shadows appeared in Sylvia's eyes. If you continue to ingest this compound, Reed warned, his voice pulling me back to the freezing park bench, you will suffer permanent neurological damage. You will actually become the senile invalid they need you to be. Croft has provided a highly concentrated binding agent. It is a liquid countermeasure you must take every morning. It will neutralize the muscle relaxant in your bloodstream, but you must completely stop consuming the food Vanessa prepares. You have to fake eating the meals and dispose of the poisoned food without leaving a single trace. I took the small plastic bottle of the countermeasure from Reed's outstretched hand and slipped it deep into my coat pocket. I will flush the food down the garbage disposal when they are not looking, I promised. I will feed it to the stray dog that wanders behind the garage. They will not suspect a thing. I am already playing the compliant fool perfectly. You had better maintain that performance, Reed said, his tone grim and urgent, because their timeline has aggressively accelerated. Croft intercepted a digital communication between Cameron and the county courthouse this morning. They are not waiting for you to naturally decline anymore. Cameron has officially filed a petition for emergency medical and financial guardianship. He is moving to have you declared completely incompetent and stripped of all your basic human rights. I gripped the edge of the wooden bench, the rough splinters biting into my calloused palms. How fast can a judge approve an emergency petition, I asked. In cases involving fabricated medical evidence from a corrupt county doctor like Aris Thorne, Reed replied coldly. A judge can grant a temporary emergency order in a matter of days. Cameron is claiming you are an immediate danger to yourself and others. He is using the incident with the forgotten keys and the fabricated stories of your confusion to paint a picture of a man who needs institutionalization. The moment that judge strikes the gavel, Cameron gains total control over your house, your pension, and the retirement accounts holding the stolen $4 million. You will be forcibly removed from your home and locked in a high-security memory care ward. You will be heavily medicated and completely silenced while he wires the embezzled funds to his offshore proxies. I nodded slowly, absorbing the terrifying reality of his words. The jaws of the trap were closing right around my neck. But they did not know I had already emptied the accounts into a blind trust. They did not know Croft had the toxicology reports proving their murder and their poisoning. They were sprinting blindly toward a brick wall, painted to look like an open road. I will not fight the petition, I said, my voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. I want Cameron to serve me the papers. I want him to look me in the eye and commit to his treason on the record. Reed stood up, smoothing his expensive suit against the bitter wind. Be prepared, Douglas. They are coming for your throat. The town car pulled away, leaving me alone with the ducks and the absolute certainty that my family was about to deliver their final blow. I shuffled back to the house, deliberately dragging my feet and keeping my shoulders hunched. The late afternoon sun was casting long, dark shadows across the driveway. Parked directly behind my old sedan was an unfamiliar vehicle. It was a sleek, silver luxury car that absolutely did not belong in our modest, working-class neighborhood. I unlocked the front door with the new keys Cameron had given me, fumbling with the lock intentionally to make enough noise to announce my arrival. I stepped into the foyer, taking off my heavy coat. The house felt unnaturally quiet. I shuffled toward the living room, clutching my chest and coughing weakly. Cameron was sitting on the leather sofa, his posture rigid and authoritative. Beside him sat a man in a cheap, shiny gray suit holding a thick leather briefcase on his lap. Vanessa was standing near the fireplace, her arms crossed over her chest, watching me with the cold, calculating eyes of a predator observing a wounded animal. Dad Cameron said, his voice completely devoid of any familial warmth. "Sit down. We need to have a very serious conversation." I blinked rapidly, swaying slightly on my feet, as if the simple act of standing was exhausting. I looked at the stranger in the shiny suit, and then back to my son. "Who is this Cameron?" I asked, letting my voice tremble with fabricated fear. "Is he a doctor?" "I do not need a doctor. I feel fine. My head is just a little cloudy today." The man in the suit stood up. He did not offer his hand. He simply opened his briefcase and pulled out a massive stack of legal documents bound by a heavy black clip. "Mr. Pierce," he said, in a nasal, monotonous voice, "I am an officer of the County Family Court. I am here to formally serve you with a petition for emergency medical and financial guardianship filed by your son, Cameron Pierce." He dropped the heavy stack of papers onto the coffee table. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. I stared at the documents, pretending to be completely uncomprehending. I looked at Cameron, my hands shaking violently as I clutched the fabric of my trousers. "Guardianship," I stammered. "I do not understand, Cameron. What does this mean? Are you trying to put me in a home?" No. Cameron leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His face was a mask of fake, tragic concern, but his eyes burned with greedy triumph. "Dad, you have to face reality," he said, his tone dripping with sickening condescension. "You are deteriorating rapidly. You cannot remember basic facts. You wander around the house confused. You are a danger to yourself. Vanessa and I have consulted with Dr. Thorne, and he agrees that your cognitive decline is severe and irreversible." I let out a ragged, desperate gasp, perfectly mimicking the panic of an old man losing his independence. "But this is my house," I protested, my voice cracking. "Your mother and I built this life. You cannot just take it away from me. I am your father, Cameron. I paid for your school. I broke my back for you." Cameron stood up, towering over my seated, hunched form. The fake concern vanished entirely, replaced by the arrogant sneer of a man who believed he was holding all the cards. "You are not capable of managing this estate anymore, Dad." He spat, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "You are going to sign the consent waiver at the back of that packet right now. If you do not sign it voluntarily, we will drag you into a courtroom on Monday morning and let the judge declare you incompetent in public. They will drag you out of this house in a straitjacket if you fight us." Vanessa stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. "It is for your own good, Douglas," she added, her voice dripping with venomous sweetness. "We have already selected a beautiful facility for you. They have locked doors so you cannot wander off and get hurt. They will manage your medications perfectly. Cameron will take over the house and all your financial accounts to ensure the money is handled responsibly. You will not have to worry about a single thing ever again." I stared at the thick legal packet on the table. This was it, the masterpiece of their betrayal. They were openly admitting their plan to strip me of my wealth, my freedom, and my dignity. They were using the very legal system designed to protect the vulnerable as a weapon of mass theft. I knew that buried within those pages was the specific clause granting Cameron total access to the retirement accounts, holding Croft's stolen $4 million. I slowly reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the heavy stack of papers. I let tears well up in my eyes, crying for the death of my son because the man standing before me was a monster wearing his skin. I flipped to the back page where a blank signature line waited to seal my fate. "You are really going to lock me away?" I whispered, looking up at Cameron with the wide, terrified eyes of a broken victim. "You are going to take everything your mother and I worked for." Cameron crossed his arms, looking down at me with absolute contempt. "I am fixing your mistakes, Dad," he said coldly. "Now sign the paper." I picked up the pen the man in the gray suit offered me. My hand shook violently as I pressed the ink to the paper. I did not sign my name clearly. I intentionally scribbled a jagged, erratic signature that perfectly matched the profile of a man suffering from advanced neurological decay. I dropped the pen and pushed the packet back across the table, burying my face in my hands and letting out a loud, pathetic sob. Cameron snatched the papers off the table, checking the signature with a victorious smirk. He nodded to the court officer, who quickly packed his briefcase and let himself out the front door. Vanessa actually laughed, a short, sharp sound of pure relief and triumph. "You did the right thing," Dad Cameron said, turning his back on me, to admire the living room he believed he now owned. "The transport team from the facility will be here on Tuesday morning to collect you. Try to pack a small bag. They do not allow you to bring much into the locked ward." They walked out of the room together, leaving me completely alone on the leather sofa. I kept my face buried in my hands, continuing to fake my muffled sobs until their footsteps disappeared upstairs. When I was absolutely certain I was alone, I lowered my hands. The tears evaporated instantly. The trembling in my fingers ceased completely. I sat in the quiet living room, staring at the empty space on the coffee table where I had just surrendered my legal rights. They thought they had won. They thought the signature on that paper was their golden ticket to $4 million and a lifetime of luxury. They had absolutely no idea that the accounts they were trying to access had already been legally vaporized. They had no idea their embezzlement was fully documented by a billionaire. They had no idea I possessed the physical evidence of their poison. I stood up from the sofa, rolling my shoulders back and feeling the immense power of my silent patience. The trap was set. The bait was taken. All that remained was the execution. The heavy silence of the living room was suffocating. I sat deep within the worn cushions of my leather armchair, the very same chair where Sylvia used to sit and read her financial thrillers on Sunday afternoons. The house felt entirely different now. It was no longer a sanctuary of shared memories and quiet retirement. It had become a meticulously constructed stage for the final act of a deadly play. I stared down at my hands resting on my knees. For 40 years, these hands had hoisted timber-secured freight and broken steel to ensure my family never wanted for anything. Now I commanded them to tremble. I forced a terrifying, uncontrollable shake into my fingers, a physical manifestation of a mind entirely unspooling into darkness. I took a deep, ragged breath, letting the air rattle harshly in my lungs, and called out for my son. My voice was intentionally weak, a pathetic, wavering sound that barely carried past the hallway. "Cameron. Please, Cameron, I need you." The sound of heavy, impatient footsteps echoed from the second floor. A moment later, Cameron appeared in the doorway of the living room. He was dressed in a sharp, casual designer sweater, holding his smartphone loosely in his hand. He looked incredibly annoyed, his jaw set in a tight line of pure inconvenience. Vanessa stepped out from behind him, holding a steaming mug of tea, her eyes narrowing as she analyzed my slumped, defeated posture. "What is it now, Dad?" Cameron sighed aggressively, checking his watch. "We are incredibly busy today. We have a massive software integration call in an hour, and we do not have time for another episode with the locks or the microwave." I did not look at him directly. I kept my gaze fixed firmly on the braided rug near my feet, allowing my jaw to tremble. "I am scared, Cameron," I whispered, letting a genuine tear of profound, localized grief slide down my weathered cheek. The grief was real, but it was not for my mind. It was for the absolute death of the boy I had raised. "I woke up this morning and I could not remember your mother's maiden name. I stared at the bathroom mirror, and I did not know what day it was. You were right. You were right at the cemetery. My mind is slipping away, and I cannot stop it." The shift in the room was instantaneous and utterly nauseating. The rigid annoyance in Cameron's posture completely vanished, replaced by an electric buzzing wave of predatory excitement. He slipped his phone into his pocket and walked slowly toward me. His movements suddenly deliberate and cautious, like a hunter approaching a wounded deer that had finally stopped kicking. Vanessa followed closely behind him. I could practically hear her heart rate accelerating. She set her mug down on the coffee table with a sharp click, her eyes wide and shining with an unholy, greedy light. "It is okay, Dad," Cameron said, his voice dropping into a sickeningly sweet, patronizing register. His tone was drenched in the kind of artificial empathy reserved for placating a confused child. "We told you this was happening. We told you that you were deteriorating. It is perfectly natural at your age after such a traumatic loss. You just need to stop fighting it." I let out a loud, pathetic sob, burying my face in my shaking, calloused hands. "I do not want to go to one of those terrible state hospitals, Cameron. I saw what they do to the elderly on the television. They tie them to the beds. They leave them alone in the dark. Please, you have to promise me you will put me somewhere nice. Somewhere with a garden. I have money in my retirement accounts. Use it. Use all of it to keep me safe." Vanessa knelt beside my chair. The scent of her expensive floral perfume made my stomach violently churn, knowing it was the exact same scent she wore the night she poisoned my wife. She placed her freezing, slender fingers over my shaking hands, pulling them gently away from my face. "Oh, Douglas," she cooed, her voice vibrating with a dark, terrifying thrill. "We would never send you to a state facility. We have already selected a premier private memory care center. It has beautiful gardens and 24-hour nurses. But you understand that we cannot secure your placement there unless we have the legal authority to manage your estate. The administrators will not admit you without a finalized financial guarantee." I looked back and forth between them, my eyes wide, vacant, and filled with a perfectly engineered terror. "What do you need me to do? I will do whatever you want. Just take the burden away from me. I cannot handle the numbers anymore. The numbers do not make sense in my head." Cameron stood up so fast he nearly knocked over the coffee table. He practically sprinted out of the living room toward the hallway. "I have the paperwork right here," he called out, his voice cracking with unchecked, frantic greed. "I had the attorneys draft it yesterday just in case you finally had a moment of clarity." He returned seconds later, clutching a thick, heavy stack of legally bound documents. He slammed them down on the mahogany table right in front of me. This was the masterstroke of their betrayal. This was the comprehensive petition for emergency medical and financial power of attorney. This was the singular legal mechanism that would hand Cameron total, unquestioned control over the retirement accounts holding Lawrence Croft's embezzled $4 million. "We need this signed right now, Dad," Cameron insisted, his breathing shallow and rapid. "I am calling a mobile notary. They have a priority dispatch service downtown. They can be here in 15 minutes. "Call them," I whispered, slumping back into the deep leather cushions, projecting an aura of total, absolute surrender. Just let me rest. The next 20 minutes were a masterclass in psychological torture. Vanessa practically danced around the living room, clearing off the dining table to create a pristine space for the signing. Cameron paced the length of the hallway, checking the front window. Every 10 seconds, his face flushed with the feverish anticipation of a man about to officially steal millions of dollars. They did not offer me a glass of water. They did not offer me a comforting word. I had ceased to be a human being to them. I was merely a fleshy ink dispenser, a necessary biological hurdle standing between them and their stolen offshore fortune. When the doorbell finally rang, Cameron ripped the door open before the chime even finished echoing. The mobile notary was a brisk, no-nonsense woman with a heavy leather briefcase and an impatient demeanor. Cameron ushered her into the dining room, practically shoving the heavy stack of legal documents into her hands. "My father is experiencing a rare window of complete lucidity," Cameron explained smoothly, perfectly playing the role of the exhausted, responsible son. "We need to execute these guardianship transfers immediately, before his cognitive state violently regresses again." The notary looked at me. I was sitting at the head of the dining table, my shoulders severely hunched, my hands clasped together in a tight, trembling knot. I offered her a weak, terrified smile, nodding my head in silent, pathetic agreement. "Are you signing these documents of your own free will, sir?" the notary asked, strictly adhering to her legal protocol. Do you understand that you are transferring total medical and financial autonomy to your son? I understand, I replied, letting my voice crack into a dry, breathless wheeze. My mind is gone, miss. My son is going to protect my retirement money. He is going to keep me safe from the state hospitals. The notary nodded, satisfied by the tragic, utterly convincing display of an old man surrendering to his fading biology. She stamped her official seal on the bottom of the final page and slid the heavy packet across the polished wood, placing a sleek black pen directly over the signature line. Cameron and Vanessa stood directly behind the notary, their eyes locked onto the black pen with a ravenous, consuming hunger. They were practically vibrating with anticipation. I reached out, allowing my fingers to fumble clumsily against the smooth plastic of the pen. I grasped it awkwardly, hovering the metal tip just millimeters above the stark white paper. I hesitated, letting my hand shake violently, maximizing their absolute agony. I could hear Cameron's breath hitch in his throat. I could feel Vanessa's eyes boring into my skull, silently screaming for me to finish the execution. I brought the pen down. I did not sign with the sharp, fluid script of the man who had managed a massive shipping terminal. I dragged the ink across the page in a jagged, erratic, chaotic scrawl. I ruined the lines, letting the signature drift lazily downward, perfectly replicating the failing motor skills of a man whose brain was dissolving into gray fog. The moment the ink lifted from the paper, the atmosphere in the room violently shattered. Cameron lunged forward, snatching the documents off the table before the ink was even fully dry. He stared at the jagged signature, a massive, uncontrollable smile splitting his face in half. He had done it. He had legally conquered his father. He had secured the ultimate firewall for his federal crimes. The notary gathered her fee, snapped her briefcase shut, and walked out the front door, entirely oblivious to the catastrophic corporate heist she had just legally facilitated. The heavy front door clicked shut. The lock engaged. Cameron and Vanessa did not even wait for the sound of her car engine to fade down the street. The illusion of the caring family evaporated into thin air, entirely discarded now that my utility song had been successfully exhausted. Vanessa let out a sharp, genuine laugh of pure, unadulterated triumph. She threw her arms around Cameron's neck, kissing him fiercely. "We did it," she whispered loudly, her voice echoing off the dining room walls, completely unconcerned that I was sitting less than 3 feet away. "The accounts are legally yours. The retirement fund is completely unlocked." "Get my laptop," Cameron commanded, his voice shaking with a manic electric energy. He slammed the signed power of attorney documents down on the kitchen counter. "Bring it down here right now. We are moving the holding matrix before Croft's internal auditors can even blink." Vanessa sprinted up the wooden stairs, her heels hammering against the oak planks I had installed. She returned seconds later, practically throwing the sleek silver laptop onto the dining table. Cameron flipped the screen open, his fingers flying across the keyboard with the blinding speed of a man desperate to finalize his theft. I remained seated at the head of the table. I did not move a single muscle. I watched them through half-lidded eyes, continuing my silent, vacant stare. "I am bypassing the secondary encryption now," Cameron muttered, his eyes glued to the glowing screen. "The proxy server is recognizing the power of attorney authorization. The retirement accounts are fully accessible. I am looking at the holding matrix right now, Vanessa. $4.2 million. It is just sitting there waiting to be cleared." "Initiate the wire," Vanessa hissed, leaning over his shoulder, her manicured fingers gripping the edge of his chair. "Send it all to the Cayman routing numbers. Bleed the entire retirement fund dry. Leave him with absolutely zero." I sat in the shadows of the dining room, breathing in the scent of their overwhelming arrogance. They were moving the money. They were actively executing the federal wire transfer they believed would make them untouchable millionaires. They were finalizing the exact digital crime that Lawrence Croft's elite cybersecurity team was currently monitoring in real time. They thought they had legally gutted a helpless, senile old man. They had absolutely no idea that the retirement accounts they were currently draining had been completely emptied and legally vaporized by Gordon Reed 5 days ago. They were not transferring real capital. They were triggering a massive, inescapable federal wire fraud alarm directly into an empty monitored digital cage. I watched the loading bar on Cameron's laptop screen inch toward completion. I did not shake. I did not cough. I sat perfectly still, my mind sharp, cold, and utterly lethal, waiting for the digital hammer to fall. The progress bar on the laptop screen moved with agonizing slowness. I sat perfectly still in the heavy dining chair, watching the green light inch across the monitor. Cameron leaned over the table, his hands gripping the edges of the mahogany wood, so tightly his knuckles turned white. Vanessa stood close behind him, her breathing shallow and rapid. They were completely mesmerized by the digital representation of their stolen wealth. They believed they were watching the final successful step of their grand design. They believed the $4 million was quietly slipping out of my compromised retirement accounts and flowing directly into their untraceable offshore holding firms. The progress bar hit 100%. A small chime echoed from the computer speakers. Transfer complete. Cameron whispered, his voice trembling with an overwhelming, greedy joy. We did it, Vanessa. The money is completely secured in the Cayman Matrix. We are untouchable. Vanessa threw her arms around his neck, pressing her face against his shoulder. She let out a long, breathless sigh of absolute relief. We are finally free, she murmured. We never have to worry about the corporate auditors again. We never have to pretend to care about this miserable house or this pathetic old man. I watched them celebrate their victory. I did not blink. I did not let my hands shake. I simply waited for the invisible snare to pull tight around their ankles. They had absolutely no idea that the documents sitting on the table beside them were completely legally worthless. They thought they had forced a broken man to sign away his autonomy. But Gordon Reed had engineered a masterpiece of legal deception. The heavy white paper the notary had provided was not standard legal stock. Reed had anticipated Cameron utilizing an emergency mobile notary service to rush the process. 3 days ago, Reed had utilized his extensive network of corporate fixers to intercept the specific notary dispatch company Cameron favored. They had chemically treated the signature pages of the blank power of attorney packets. The chemical compound was completely invisible to the naked eye, but it reacted violently with the specific ink inside the black pen I had used. Within 48 hours, the jagged, chaotic signature I had provided would completely oxidize and vanish, leaving the paper entirely blank. But the chemical treatment was merely a secondary precaution. The true brilliance of Reed's trap lay in the quiet halls of the state Supreme Court. 2 days before Cameron even filed his emergency petition, Gordon Reed had already stood before a Supreme Court judge in a closed, sealed chamber. He had presented the sworn affidavits I had signed on the park bench. Those affidavits legally transferred every single genuine asset Sylvia and I owned into the impenetrable blind trust. But Reed went one step further. He filed a preemptive medical directive officially declaring me to be in perfect cognitive health, backed by comprehensive evaluations from 3 independent board-certified neurologists. Those sealed Supreme Court affidavits legally neutralized any future guardianship petitions before they could even be filed. The documents Cameron held were legally void the moment they were printed. I was not a ward of the state. I was not a helpless victim. I was the fully autonomous architect of their destruction. Cameron pulled away from Vanessa's embrace and tapped the laptop trackpad to refresh the screen. He wanted to look at the offshore account balances. He wanted to see the massive numbers confirming his new life of luxury. He hit the refresh key and waited. The screen went completely blank for 3 seconds. A small spinning wheel appeared in the center of the monitor. That is strange, Cameron muttered, leaning closer to the keyboard. The proxy server is lagging. It usually updates the balance ledger instantaneously. Vanessa frowned, her celebratory smile faltering slightly. Just refresh the connection, she suggested, brushing a piece of lint off his designer sweater. The routing numbers probably just need a minute to clear the international gateways. Cameron hit the key again. The spinning wheel vanished. The screen flashed bright red. A massive block of stark white text appeared across the monitor. It was not a banking confirmation. It was a severe critical system failure notification. Cameron froze. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a polished corpse. He stared at the red screen, his eyes wide with sudden, uncomprehending panic. "What is this?" he whispered, his fingers flying across the keyboard in a frantic, desperate rhythm. "The matrix is locked. The gateway is completely blocking my access credentials." "What do you mean it is blocking you?" Vanessa demanded, her voice rising in pitch. "You just said the transfer was complete. Where is the money, Cameron?" He did not answer her. He kept hammering the keys, opening command prompts, and trying to force the system to bypass the error codes. Sweat began to bead on his forehead. The arrogant swagger he had carried for weeks was evaporating by the second. The digital walls were closing in exactly as Lawrence Croft had promised. Croft's cybersecurity team had not been sitting idle while Cameron drained my false accounts. They had been waiting in the dark digital spaces, watching every single move my son made. They had identified his offshore dummy accounts weeks ago. They had mapped the entire architecture of his embezzlement ring, but they needed one final piece of undeniable proof to secure federal indictments. They needed Cameron to initiate a massive transfer from a known compromised terminal, directly linking his physical location and his digital signature to the stolen corporate funds. By forcing me to sign the fake power of attorney and instantly triggering the wire transfer, Cameron had just handed the federal investigators the absolute smoking gun. He had unknowingly tripped a massive silent alarm. The offshore accounts he believed were safe havens were actually digital honeypots, carefully constructed by Croft's team. The moment the $4 million hit those servers, the funds were instantly quarantined and frozen by federal authorities. But the trap was far more vicious than a simple frozen account. The transfer protocol was specifically designed to execute a reverse trace. Cameron slammed his fist against the dining table, making the laptop jump. "The offshore server is bouncing the connection," he shouted, his voice cracking with pure terror. "It is throwing a federal compliance error code." The money did not route to the Caymans. It was intercepted. Someone intercepted the secure tunnel. Vanessa grabbed his shoulder, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his sweater. "Fix it!" she screamed, her facade of calm control completely shattering. "You told me this system was flawless. You told me nobody could trace the dummy data. I cannot fix it!" Cameron roared, pushing her hand away and staring at the screen in absolute horror. "The proxy shields are failing. Someone is aggressively mapping our local network. They are tracing the signal back to this exact IP address. They are locking down my administrative privileges from the outside." I remained seated at the head of the table. I took a deep, slow breath, filling my lungs with the sweet, clean air of absolute victory. I let my shoulders unhunch. I straightened my spine, pressing my back firmly against the heavy wooden chair. I placed my hands flat on the mahogany table. The tremors were completely gone. My fingers were steady, solid, and immovable. "The money is gone, Cameron," I said. My voice did not shake. It was not the weak, pathetic wheeze of a broken old man. It was a deep, resonant baritone anchored by 40 years of hard labor and unwavering discipline. It was the voice of the father he had forgotten how to respect. Cameron and Vanessa snapped their heads toward me. They stared at my steady hands and my rigid posture. The utter confusion on their faces was beautiful to witness. They could not comprehend the sudden physical transformation. They were looking at a ghost who had suddenly decided to put on armor. "What did you say?" Cameron breathed, stepping away from the laptop. "I said the money is gone." I repeated, my gaze locking onto his terrified eyes. "It never actually left the corporate servers. You did not transfer $4 million to the Caymans. You just authorized a direct traceable connection between your laptop and a federally monitored honey trap." Vanessa stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the kitchen counter. Her eyes darted from me to the voided legal documents sitting near the laptop. "You are crazy," she stammered, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You do not know what you are talking about. Your brain is rotting." I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up. I drew myself up to my full height, towering over the table. My brain is perfectly fine, Vanessa, I said, stepping slowly toward them. But I cannot say the same for my blood. The forensic laboratory confirmed the presence of the synthetic muscle relaxant you have been dumping into my dinner for the past week. It was a very clever strategy. You almost managed to chemically manufacture a perfect case of advanced dementia. Vanessa's mouth dropped open. She let out a small, choked gasp, covering her lips with her hands. She looked at Cameron silently, begging him to fix the impossible nightmare unfolding in front of them. "You are lying," Cameron shouted, his voice shrill and desperate. He scrambled to grab the power of attorney documents, clutching them to his chest like a shield. "I have your signature right here. I have the legal authority. You signed it in front of a court officer. You gave me control." "Those papers are entirely worthless," I stated, taking another step forward. "The ink you forced me to use is chemically treated. By tomorrow morning, that page will be completely blank. But even if it remained legible, it would not save you. 3 days ago, Gordon Reed stood before a state Supreme Court judge and filed sworn sealed affidavits. I legally transferred every single genuine asset your mother and I owned into an irrevocable blind trust. I hold zero legal claim to any wealth. The accounts you just tried to drain were empty shells maintained by Lawrence Croft explicitly to catch you in the act." Cameron dropped the documents onto the floor. His hands began to shake violently, mirroring the exact fake tremors I had performed for him just an hour ago. "You set us up," he whispered, his eyes wide with a frantic, manic realization. "You knew about the embezzlement. You knew everything. Your mother knew I corrected him," my voice turning hard and cold. "Sylvia audited the logistics ledgers before she died. She found your dummy corporation. She found the missing millions, and because she found your mess, you decided to poison her. You murdered my wife to protect your pathetic, failing startup." Vanessa let out a sharp, terrified wail. "We did not want to hurt her," she cried, backing away toward the front door. Cameron said it was the only way. He said she was going to turn us over to the federal authorities. We just needed to keep her quiet. Cameron spun around, glaring at his wife with murderous rage. "Shut your mouth," he screamed, his face purple with fury. "Do not say another word. He is trying to record us. He is wearing a wire." I slowly reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I held it up so they could both see the blank, dark screen. "I do not need to record you, Cameron," I said softly. "Lawrence Croft already has everything he needs. His cybersecurity team has been compiling your digital footprint for weeks. They have the server logs. They have the offshore routing codes. And now, thanks to your absolute arrogance, they have the final wire transfer request initiated directly from your personal computer inside this house." Cameron stared at the blank phone and then looked back at his laptop screen. The red error message was still flashing brightly, throwing a harsh crimson glow across the dark dining room. He realized the inescapable totality of his failure. He had built his entire criminal empire on the assumption that I was a weak, oblivious fool. He had assumed his mother was a disposable obstacle. He had built a house of cards on a foundation of pure arrogance, and now the wind was tearing it completely apart. "You destroyed my life," Cameron sobbed, sinking to his knees on the hardwood floor. He buried his hands in his hair, pulling hard, as if trying to rip the terrible reality out of his skull. "I am your son. How could you do this to your own son? You ceased to be my son the moment you handed Vanessa the poison." I replied, my voice devoid of any sympathy or warmth. "You destroyed your own life, Cameron. I simply stepped out of your way and let you fall." I walked past him, stepping over the discarded, useless legal documents scattered on the floor. I walked toward the front hallway, grabbing my heavy winter coat from the brass hook. Vanessa was huddled in the corner by the front door, shaking uncontrollably, tears streaming down her pale, ruined face. She did not look like an elite corporate director anymore. She looked like a terrified, trapped rat. "Where are you going?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "I am going for a walk," I said, pulling my coat over my broad shoulders. "I need some fresh air. I suggest you both use this time to call a very expensive criminal defense attorney. though I doubt you will be able to afford one now that your credit lines have been entirely frozen. I opened the heavy wooden front door, letting the freezing evening wind sweep into the warm house. I looked back at the dining room one last time. Cameron was still kneeling on the floor, sobbing into his hands. The red light from the laptop screen washed over his shaking shoulders. It was a pathetic, miserable sight, but I felt absolutely nothing. The deep burning rage that had consumed my chest for weeks was completely extinguished, leaving behind a cold, silent peace. I stepped out onto this porch and pulled the door shut behind me. The lock engaged with a heavy, solid click. I walked down the concrete steps and turned onto the sidewalk. I did not drag my left foot. I did not hunch my shoulders. I walked with long, powerful strides, feeling the strength in my legs and the clarity in my mind. The distant sound of sirens began to echo through the quiet suburban streets. They were faint at first, a low wailing hum, bouncing off the brick houses and bare trees. But they were growing steadily louder, approaching fast from the direction of the city center. Federal agents do not waste time once a wire fraud alarm is officially triggered. I kept walking, keeping my eyes fixed on the horizon. The sky was turning a deep, bruised purple as the sun finally set behind the neighborhood. Sylvia was gone, but her brilliant mind and her meticulous preparation had allowed me to secure our legacy and deliver absolute justice to the monsters who had betrayed us. The conflict was finally over. The cage had snapped shut, and I was the one walking away holding the key. The sirens shrieked loudly as they passed the cross street, racing toward my address. The flashing blue and red lights illuminated the snowbanks and the parked cars. I did not look back. I just kept walking forward, letting the sound of the approaching justice sing me a cold, beautiful lullaby. The trap had worked perfectly. The silent execution was complete. The world was right again. The sleek glass elevator carried Cameron and Vanessa up 40 floors into the absolute pinnacle of the Croft Logistics empire. Cameron adjusted his silk tie, checking his reflection in the mirrored doors. He smelled of expensive cologne and misplaced confidence. Vanessa stood beside him, tapping her designer heel against the polished steel floor. She wore a tailored black dress projecting the image of a grieving daughter-in-law completely ready to collect her murdered mother-in-law's corporate life insurance. They believed they were walking into a standard administrative meeting. They expected a sympathetic human resources director to hand them a lucrative check recognizing Sylvia's 40 years of dedicated service. They thought they had left me locked in the house waiting for a medical transport van to drag me to a psychiatric ward. They thought they were untouchable. The elevator doors chimed and slid open, revealing a massive reception area bathed in harsh clinical sunlight. A silent security guard in a dark suit directed them down a long corridor, lined with frosted glass walls. Cameron walked with the arrogant stride of a man who believed he had outsmarted a billionaire. He reached for the heavy chrome handle of the main boardroom, pushing the door open with a dramatic flourish. He stepped into the room, ready to offer fake tears and collect real money, but the words completely died in his throat. He stopped so abruptly that Vanessa collided with his shoulder. The boardroom was cavernous and cold. At the far end of a massive black marble table sat Lawrence Croft, his hands steepled under his chin, radiating absolute corporate menace. But Croft was not the focal point of the room. Sitting directly at the head of the table, occupying the seat of absolute authority, was a man Cameron did not immediately recognize. It was me. I was not wearing the faded flannel shirts and scuffed slippers they had grown accustomed to. I wore an immaculate tailored charcoal suit provided by Gordon Reed. My shoulders were pulled back. My spine was straight. The trembling in my hands was completely gone, replaced by the terrifying stillness of a man who had successfully completed a long and brutal hunt. I looked down the length of the marble table, meeting my son's eyes with a gaze so cold and unyielding it seemed to freeze the air in his lungs. Sitting to my immediate right was Gordon Reed, calmly sorting through a stack of pristine legal folders. To my left sat a woman in a crisp white clinical coat, holding a sealed plastic evidence bag containing the familiar sterile vials. Flanking the heavy glass doors directly behind Cameron and Vanessa stood two men in identical dark blue suits, Their posture was rigid, and their eyes scanned the room with the unmistakable clinical detachment of federal agents. Cameron blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing, as his brain completely failed to process the visual data. "Dad," he finally choked out, his voice pitching high with absolute confusion. "What are you doing here? You are supposed to be at the house waiting for the medical transport. Why are you dressed like that?" I did not answer him. I did not move a single muscle. I simply watched him drown in his own sudden terror. Gordon Reed stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket. He looked at Cameron with the specific kind of disgust usually reserved for insects. "Douglas Pierce is exactly where he is supposed to be," Reed stated, his voice echoing sharply off the glass walls. "Please take a seat, Cameron. We have a substantial amount of documentation to cover regarding your mother's corporate benefits and your own recent financial activities." Vanessa grabbed Cameron's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his sleeve. Her eyes darted frantically around the room, lingering on the federal agents blocking the exit. "Cameron, what is going on?" she hissed, her facade of absolute control beginning to violently crack. "Why are there security agents in here?" Cameron ignored her. He stumbled toward the table, pulling out a leather chair and collapsing into it. He stared at me desperately, searching my face for the broken, senile old man he thought he had legally conquered just 24 hours ago. "Dad, please talk to me," Cameron pleaded, trying to inject a tone of familial concern into his shaking voice. "You are confused. Your mind is sick. You do not understand what these men are making you do. We have the medical power of attorney. I am legally responsible for your care." I rested my forearms on the cold marble table, leaning forward slightly. "My mind is perfectly clear, Cameron," I said, my voice a deep, resonant baritone that filled every corner of the vast boardroom. "It is clearer than it has been in 40 years, and you do not hold legal responsibility for anything except the massive federal crimes you committed last night from my dining room table." Cameron recoiled as if I had physically struck him across the face. The last desperate shreds of his arrogance evaporated, leaving behind nothing but naked, primal panic. Gordon Reed opened a blue legal folder and slid a single sheet of paper down the table. It was the power of attorney document Cameron had forced me to sign. "You will notice, Cameron, that the signature line is entirely blank," Reed said smoothly. "The ink provided by the mobile notary was a highly unstable chemical compound. It oxidized and vanished completely within hours. But even if it had remained legible, the document was legally voided days before you even filed your emergency petition. Your father executed a series of sealed Supreme Court affidavits transferring his entire genuine estate into a blind trust. You never had legal authority. You never had control. You were merely an arrogant thief attempting to pick a lock that did not exist." Vanessa began to hyperventilate. She gripped the back of Cameron's chair, her knuckles turning white. "You cannot do this," she cried, her voice cracking with terror. "We are your family, Douglas. We were just trying to protect your assets. We were trying to help you." "You were trying to steal $4 million, I corrected her, my tone completely devoid of any sympathy or emotion. "You were trying to use my compromised banking identity to funnel stolen corporate funds into a Cayman Islands holding matrix. Unfortunately for you both, the accounts you accessed were digital honeypots engineered by Mr. Croft's cybersecurity division." Lawrence Croft leaned forward, resting his hands heavily on the table. The gold rings on his fingers gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the boardroom. "When you initiated that wire transfer last night, Cameron, you did not move any actual capital." Croft growled, his voice rumbling like an approaching earthquake. "You triggered a massive federal alarm mechanism built directly into my personal security grid. You explicitly tied your personal computer and your home network directly to the stolen corporate funds. You thought you were hacking a blind server, but you were actually knocking on the front door of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The two gentlemen standing by the door are special agents who have been tracking your digital footprint for weeks. They have already secured warrants for your proxy servers, your dummy corporation, and the fraudulent lines of credit your wife opened in your father's name." Cameron buried his face in his hands, letting out a long, pathetic wail of absolute despair. His entire world was collapsing with terrifying speed. He realized he was not the mastermind of a brilliant heist. He was simply a rat caught in a meticulously constructed trap. He had destroyed his life, his marriage, and his freedom, all for the illusion of stolen wealth. But federal wire fraud is only a fraction of the agenda today. Gordon Reed continued, signaling to the woman in the white coat. The financial crimes will secure your imprisonment for decades, but they do not address the most heinous aspect of your strategy. A new wave of terror washed over the room as the woman in the white coat stepped forward. She placed the small, sterile medical vials I had successfully smuggled out of the house onto the polished table. "I am Dr. Eris," she stated, her voice clinical and detached. "I run the independent toxicology laboratory for Croft Logistics. The test results from the food samples provided by Mr. Pierce confirm a horrifying reality." Vanessa let out a choked gasp, backing away from the table, as if the glass vials were actively burning her. "It is a highly synthesized muscle relaxant," Dr. Eris explained, tapping a thick, printed laboratory report sitting on the marble table. "It is an incredibly malicious piece of pharmacology. It aggressively manufactures the clinical symptoms of advanced neurological decay, causing severe motor function impairment, massive short-term memory loss, and profound debilitating lethargy. It was designed to mimic the exact biological markers of a rapidly progressing dementia. If Mr. Pierce had actually consumed the meals provided by his family, he would have suffered permanent catastrophic brain damage within a matter of weeks. The chemical structure is nearly identical to the agent used to trigger the fatal cardiac arrest in his late wife, only modified for a slower, more agonizing degradation." I stood up slowly, buttoning my suit jacket. I walked around the massive marble table, my footsteps echoing loudly in the silent room. I stopped directly in front of Vanessa. She cowered against the glass, unable to escape the crushing weight of her exposed guilt. "You thought you were so clever," I said, staring down into her terrified eyes. "You thought you could chemically lobotomize me in my own dining room. You thought you could manufacture my dementia so you could lock me in a state facility and steal my home. But you were sloppy, Vanessa. You used the exact same chemical foundation you used to murder my wife." Cameron jerked his head up, staring at Vanessa with absolute horror. "You killed Mom," he gasped, his voice breaking into a wet, ragged sob. "You told me it was just a sedative. You told me she would just sleep through the audit." Vanessa burst into loud, uncontrollable tears, sliding down the glass wall until she collapsed onto the floor. "I did not mean to," she wailed, burying her face in her knees. She found the corporate ledger's Cameron. She knew about the dummy corporation. She was going to ruin everything. I just needed her to be quiet. The two federal agents stepped forward, pulling heavy steel handcuffs from their belts. The sound of the metal ratchets clicking open filled the room with a cold, metallic finality. "Cameron Pierce and Vanessa Pierce, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit murder." The lead agent stated, his voice a flat, emotionless drone. Cameron did not resist as the agent pulled his arms behind his back and secured the heavy steel cuffs around his wrists. He looked completely hollowed out, a fragile shell of the arrogant man who had walked into the room minutes ago. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a desperate, pathetic plea for salvation. "Dad, please help me," he cried, weeping openly. "I am your son. You cannot let them take me away. I am your flesh and blood." I looked at the weeping, broken man who shared my last name. I searched my heart for any lingering trace of paternal affection. I felt absolutely nothing. The deep, burning rage that had sustained my quiet performance for weeks had completely burned out, leaving behind a cold, silent, and absolute peace. I remembered 40 years of backbreaking physical labor, pulling double shifts at the freezing freight terminal just to buy him a new bicycle for his birthday. I remembered Sylvia staying up late into the night, packing his school lunches and kissing his forehead while he slept. I remembered the absolute contempt and the casual cruelty he had shown us in return, treating our home like an inheritance waiting to be liquidated. "My son died the day he decided his mother's life was worth less than a stolen paycheck," I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of mercy. You are just a thief who got caught trying to steal from a dead woman. The agents hauled Cameron to his feet, dragging him roughly toward the glass doors. Vanessa was already handcuffed, weeping hysterically as she was pulled down the corridor. Their cries echoed through the immaculate corporate lobby, growing fainter and fainter until the heavy elevator doors finally sealed them away forever. The vast boardroom descended into absolute silence. Lawrence Croft nodded slowly, a grim expression of respect settling on his weathered face. "It is done," Douglas Croft said quietly. "The corporate funds will be recovered, and the cancer has been excised from your life." Gordon Reed gathered his legal documents, snapping his heavy briefcase shut with a sharp, definitive click. "Your blind trust is fully operational, Douglas. Your genuine assets are completely secure and entirely disconnected from the fraudulent debts your daughter-in-law accumulated. You are free to walk away and rebuild your life on your own terms." I turned and walked toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling city skyline. The morning fog was finally burning off, revealing a crisp, clear blue sky. I stood there for a long time, watching the tiny cars move like insects on the streets below. I had successfully navigated the darkest, most treacherous labyrinth of my existence. I had confronted the ultimate betrayal and emerged completely victorious, not through violence or screaming rage, but through absolute patience and meticulous execution. I had restored the natural order. I had honored Sylvia's memory. I was completely alone, but for the first time in a very long time, I felt completely free. The invisible snare had snapped perfectly shut, and the predators were finally locked in the cage they had built for me. The air in the glass boardroom was completely still. Cameron and Vanessa stood frozen, staring at me, as if the floor had just vanished beneath their feet. I did not shout. I did not need to raise my voice. I sat at the head of the heavy marble table and let the absolute silence crush the last remnants of their arrogance. I reached out with steady hands and pulled 3 identical manila folders from the stack Gordon Reed had prepared. I placed my fingertips on the first folder and pushed it slowly across the polished stone surface until it stopped directly in front of Vanessa. "Open it!" I commanded, my voice a low rumble that vibrated through the room. Vanessa did not want to touch it, but the presence of the federal agents standing by the door forced her hand. Her manicured fingers trembled as she flipped the cardboard cover open. Staring back at her were dozens of pages of highly complex chemical analyses and highlighted laboratory results. "That is a comprehensive forensic toxicology report," I explained, leaning back in my chair. "You assumed my wife simply suffered a sudden cardiac event. You assumed her age and her stressful work schedule made her a perfect candidate for a natural death. But Sylvia was an auditor. She was meticulous. She left a blood sample with her primary physician during a routine checkup exactly 2 days before she died. We had that sample retested yesterday by Dr. Aris, who is sitting to my left." Dr. Aris leaned forward, interlacing her fingers. "We found lethal concentrations of a highly synthesized muscle relaxant in your mother's preserved blood sample," Dr. Aris stated clinically. "It is an obscure paralytic agent primarily used in heavy veterinary procedures. It causes catastrophic heart failure while leaving almost no immediate chemical trace." Vanessa began to shake, her breathing shallow and rapid. "You cannot prove anything," she stammered, stepping back from the table. I slid a smaller plastic evidence bag across the table, stopping it right beside the open folder. It contained the tiny sterile vials Croft had given me. "But you did not stop with Sylvia," when I continued, ignoring her pathetic denial. "You decided I was the next vulnerability that needed to be managed. You started lacing my dinners with a heavily diluted derivative of the exact same paralytic. You needed me alive but mentally destroyed so you could secure a medical power of attorney. You manufactured my dementia symptoms every single night in my own kitchen. Every meal you served me went directly into those sterile vials while you had your back turned. The laboratory confirmed the exact chemical match this morning. You poisoned my wife to protect your embezzlement, and you poisoned me to steal my house." Cameron whipped his head around, staring at his wife with a look of absolute uncomprehending horror. "You killed my mother." He gasped, his face draining of all color. You told me you were just keeping her quiet. You told me it was a mild sedative. Vanessa shook her head frantically, tears spilling over her pale cheeks. She was going to ruin us. Cameron, she cried out, her voice shrill and desperate. She found the dummy corporation. She was going to the federal regulators. I had to stop her. I did not give them a moment to process their fractured marriage. I placed my hand on the second folder and slid it firmly across the marble, stopping it directly in front of my son. Look at it, Cameron, I ordered. Cameron reached out with a trembling hand and flipped the cover back. His eyes darted across the pages, scanning the endless rows of IP addresses, routing numbers, and digital timestamps. The final shred of his criminal fantasy dissolved in real time. You spent the last 3 weeks bragging about your flawless software architecture, I said, my voice devoid of any warmth. You thought you were brilliantly funneling $4 million of stolen corporate capital into untraceable offshore accounts. But Lawrence Croft does not hire fools. His cybersecurity division identified your proxy servers a month ago. They did not shut you down because they needed you to hang yourself with your own rope. Gordon Reed adjusted his silver tie and looked at Cameron with absolute professional disdain. The retirement accounts you accessed last night from your father's living room were digital honeypots, Reed explained smoothly. They were empty shells monitored directly by federal authorities. The moment you initiated that wire transfer, you did not move any money. You triggered a massive silent alarm. You explicitly tied your personal computer, your home network, and your digital signature directly to the stolen corporate funds. You provided the federal investigators with the exact forensic evidence they needed to secure a 50-year prison sentence. Cameron stared at the papers, his jaw working silently. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on a landmine. You set me up, he whispered, his voice breaking. You knew I was logging into the system. I knew exactly what you were doing, I replied, my tone flattening into a cold, mechanical rhythm. You needed a firewall. You needed a confused old man to take the fall for your federal wire fraud. I simply gave you the illusion of success so you would walk willingly into the trap. I reached for the third and final folder. I did not slide this one. I picked it up and held it in my steady hands, letting Cameron stare at the heavy state seal stamped on the front cover. You thought you won last night, I continued, holding the folder up to the light. You forced me to sign that emergency medical and financial guardianship petition. You thought you had legally stripped me of my autonomy and gained total control over my estate. But Gordon Reed is a far better attorney than you are a thief. Reed nodded slightly, acknowledging the truth. The documents you forced your father to sign were printed on chemically treated paper. Reed stated, his voice echoing off the glass walls. The ink you provided oxidized and vanished hours ago. But even if the signature remained, the document is entirely legally void. 2 days before you filed your fraudulent petition, I stood before a state Supreme Court judge in a sealed chamber. We executed irrevocable affidavits transferring every genuine asset your parents owned into a blind trust. I am the sole managing executor. Your father legally owns nothing. Your guardianship petition was annulled before it was ever even printed. I tossed the third folder onto the table, where it landed with a heavy, definitive thud. You have absolutely no power, Cameron, I said, staring directly into his terrified eyes. You have no money. You have no house. You have no leverage. You are standing in the middle of a burning building that you set on fire yourself. Cameron collapsed into the leather boardroom chair, gripping his hair with both hands. He let out a long, agonizing wail of pure defeat. His entire existence had been built on the assumption that he was the smartest man in the room. He had viewed my silence as weakness and my patience as senility. He never realized he was dealing with a man who had spent 4 decades managing complex, heavy logistics and surviving in a world built on unforgiving physics. He had completely miscalculated the structural integrity of his own father. Vanessa leaned against the glass wall, sliding down until she hit the floor. She wrapped her arms around her knees, rocking back and forth, as the reality of her impending federal prison sentence crushed the breath from her lungs. The pristine image she had carefully cultivated was completely obliterated, leaving behind a terrified murderer who had failed at every single objective. The execution of order was complete. The three folders sat on the table representing the absolute destruction of their lives. There was no screaming. There was no physical violence. There was only the cold, hard application of undeniable truth. I turned my head slightly and looked at the two federal agents standing quietly by the doors. I gave them a single brief nod. The federal agents moved in. They crossed the boardroom with terrifying efficiency, offering no dramatic speeches and answering no desperate questions. They simply pulled heavy steel handcuffs from their belts and approached the table. One agent hauled Vanessa to her feet, ignoring her hysterical sobbing as he ratcheted the cold metal around her slender wrists. The other agent grabbed Cameron by the shoulder, pulling him out of the leather chair and twisting his arms behind his back. Cameron fought against the grip, his face red and slick with tears. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic panic. "Dad. Please," he screamed, his voice cracking as the handcuffs clicked shut. "You cannot let them do this. We are family. I am your son. Please stop them." I stood up from the marble table. I buttoned my tailored jacket and looked my son dead in the eye. I did not feel a shred of pity. I did not feel any lingering paternal warmth. I felt only the deep, absolute peace of a man who had finally balanced an irreconcilable ledger. "Family does not poison my wife," I replied, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper that cut through his pathetic screaming. "You are just a liability I am liquidating." Cameron opened his mouth to beg again, but the federal agent shoved him forward, marching him forcefully toward the heavy glass doors. Vanessa followed, stumbling blindly as she wept. They were dragged down the pristine corporate corridor, their cries echoing off the frosted glass until the elevator doors finally swallowed them whole. I stood in the silent boardroom listening to the faint hum of the ventilation system. Lawrence Croft walked around the table and stood beside me, looking out at the sprawling city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Gordon Reed packed his briefcases with methodical precision, leaving nothing but the three folders on the polished stone. "It is finished," Douglas Croft said quietly. "The accounts are secure. The corporate cancer is entirely removed." I nodded slowly, feeling the tension drain out of my muscles for the first time in weeks. I turned away from the empty table and walked out of the boardroom. I walked through the quiet lobby and rode the elevator down to the ground floor. I stepped out through the revolving glass doors and onto the busy pavement. The sky above the skyline was a brilliant, piercing blue. The winter wind was sharp and clean. I took a deep breath, letting the crisp air fill my lungs. The heavy burden of betrayal and the suffocating weight of my silent performance were completely gone. I pulled my coat tightly around my shoulders and began walking down the avenue, blending perfectly into the crowded street, moving forward with the quiet grace of a man whose world was finally at peace. Equilibrium had been restored. This story demonstrates that true strength often lies not in explosive fury, but in profound patience and meticulous calculation. When faced with ultimate betrayal, the most powerful response is rarely a blind counterattack, but rather a quiet, strategic realignment of truth and consequence. Vulnerability should never be mistaken for weakness, and the silence of a disregarded patriarch can become the very foundation upon which a masterful execution of justice is built. Share your thoughts on this story below. What would you have done if you were in Douglas's position?